Now, as I said at the top of the show, union bosses have described proposed pay increases for public sector workers as a kick in the teeth, saying it's actually a real terms pay cut due to high inflation. The General Secretary of the Unite Union even went as far as to describe the pay rise as a betrayal. The increases will see some police officers getting as much as an 8.8% extra pay rise, with NHS staff getting at least 4.5% pay rise, teachers 5% and armed forces staff 3.5%. So are the unions right that public sector workers deserve an even higher pay rise? Or are their demands unreasonable during a time of high inflation when, let's not forget, a lot of people in the private sector are struggling? So to debate this, I'm joined by Joe Vendry, spokesman for the Taxpayers Alliance. I nearly misgendered you there, Joe. And John McTernan, political strategist and former director of political operations for Tony Blair. John, start off with you. Do public sector workers deserve a pay rise that's in line with inflation, which, as the unions have been saying, is generation defining in how high it is? But is it right at a time when, of course, people in the private sector are struggling too?
Well, private sector pay increases are on average around 7 to 8%. So if public sector workers got the same, they'd at least be level pegging with them. But I think the public sector pay settlements, this inflation comes and this pay cut, because it's half of the inflation rate basically for most public sector workers. This pay cut comes after a decade of pressure downwards on public sector wages. And the consequence is the next item you're going to be discussing, or an item you're discussing later, which is massive NHS waiting lists. And there are massive staff shortages in the NHS. And the inability of the public sector to recruit to jobs should clearly be part of the consideration when giving a wage increase. Public sector wages only cover 14%, 15% of workers in the UK. So they're irrelevant in terms of inflation. They're relevant in terms of whether people are getting a pay cut. They're relevant in terms of whether you're recruiting enough people to critical public services. And it's absolutely clear that staff shortages are part of the catastrophic waiting list crisis in the NHS.
But John, isn't it the case, though, that if we start hiking public sector pay packets, the inflationary pressures that we're feeling right now are only going to be exacerbated?
How does a nurse's wage impact on inflation?
Well, it's not just the NHS. If it's across the entire public sector, there's a hell of a lot of people employed in the public sector.
Wage increase inflation?
Well,
explain to me how the wage of a police officer or a nurse increase inflation. It doesn't. They don't sell services.
So, Joe, there is absolutely nothing a matter with hiking public sector pay packets, says John.
Well, look, I certainly don't begrudge anyone for wanting to see more money in their pockets right now. You know, as we've discussed, inflation is sitting at 9.4%, and we're all contended with the cost of living crisis. But I think with that in mind, for union bosses to call these proposed rises a kick in the teeth is a bit outrageous. I mean, after all, it is hard-working taxpayers across both sectors who will ultimately be the ones footing the bill. And, I think as things stand, we know these pay rises have been offered and they will apparently come out of existing budgets, which hadn't factored in rises quite so big. So I think the onus now really falls onto these departments to tighten their belts and find that cash by cracking down on wasteful spending.
So, Joe, do you actually think we're in for a summer of discontent here? Do you think the unions are going to continue to make their demands? And actually, at this time, we've got a government that's in complete disarray. So they're going to get what they want, aren't they?
Well, it's certainly looking like we've got a summer of discontent ahead. But, what I would ask is, when it comes to the union's demands, what are they actually hoping to achieve? I mean, let's look at some of the things that they're demanding. You've got the British Medical Association calling for a 30% pay rise for doctors over the next 5 years. I mean, how do they actually expect that to be paid for? Let's not forget, recently, on top of everything, workers have had to endure a national insurance rise, supposedly to fix backlogs in the NHS. So I think unions need to really realise that everybody is struggling at the moment, and placing these enormous demands on normal, ordinary, hard-working taxpayers is just deeply unfair.